Okay. Hello, live stream viewers, or after live stream viewers, recording viewers. Um, Welcome to Fitz's first Flutter live stream. This is my first time doing this, and I'm doing it obviously from my lovely home. We've got some sun outside, so it's a beautiful day. Just to start things off, in the spirit of my colleague Philip, who started this live streaming idea, we um, wanted to try to provide an opportunity for us to connect with community members and find a way to talk to people, and even if it's just really us talking at the camera, the screen, and at least we are here out talking to you, and having being able to see you out here on the chat and being here with you. I know there's a lot of challenging things happening around the world with stay-at-home orders and people out of work and whatnot. But hopefully we can be here and have some fun with Flutter and hopefully do some interesting apps and play around with some interesting things. So what I'm going to do today, we'll be here for a little bit, and my goal for the day is to build a new app from scratch. And the idea that I have for this app is to use this as a basis for teaching new Flutter developers how to do Flutter. So the app should be relatively simple, but have an ability to grow and expand beyond just the simple things. So we could imagine this hypothetical app having the ability to expand to having Firebase and cloud backends, to having multiple users, to having a web and a desktop and a mobile interface, and all of this stuff. So that's the desire. That's the reason for wanting to do this app. So to start off with, and I'm curious how much of a delay we have on the chat, but we'll see. When I tested it earlier, the delay wasn't too bad. But to start off with, I'm wondering for the folks that are watching if there's ideas for things we could do, like genres of apps that we could do for a relatively simple app, but has a big expansion of things that it could possibly go into. So this is where we're going to determine how much of a delay the chat has. We're counting down. I think when I tested earlier, it was in anywhere between like 7 and 30 seconds. And I think we've seen it go up to as much as maybe a minute, depending on what the quality levels are like. So the couple of typical starting apps for users have been things like a chat app or a to-do app, or those are pretty much the usual ones. Some kind of list-based view that's somewhat dynamic, and you have the ability to maybe add more users in later. And so one potential idea that we have, I was talking with some of my teammates, and someone threw out the idea of a to-do app that adds random things to the to-do list, which is kind of interesting. And honestly, I felt that was maybe kind of stressful in some ways, because then the to-do list is ever growing with random ideas. And so a second idea that they had was to look at a app for planning an upcoming space adventure. And that's kind of interesting because it has practical purposes. We can have a to-do app-like thing and somewhat of a project management app thing. And but it's also kind of silly and whimsical because we don't actually go out into space on big adventures, at least as we do. So that's kind of where I want to go from, is this idea of the combination of like a to-do app and a project management planner, but in the context of we're getting ready to go on a space adventure. And so hopefully we can weave in some basic widget compositions, as well as getting in some animations. And my hope eventually for this is that we can get into some more interesting cloud backends. Okay, so let's try to get this going. So I went ahead and started this out earlier, but I didn't write a scaffold. That would be why. So this is going to be very ad lib, very ad hoc. I've got my screen over there, so I can always be looking at you all, and there will be mistakes. It's kind of like the boring show, where we're just going to have fun coding, and wherever it goes, it'll go. Okay, so we're gonna start off with some of the basics to get our app going. And there we go. Okay. Now, so obviously this is just the initial beginning. All we have is our material app and a scaffold. And what my aim is to do here, and maybe I'll pull up like a drawing app. It's like Draw.io. Wait for it. Let's do local, create new, and we'll do a blank diagram, create. There it is. Okay, so my idea here is that we'll start off with, here's my basic phone structure, and then at the top, I want more or less the, this is going to be the progress tracker up here. I know that's small. I'll make it bigger in a second. So I want my progress tracker up top. So we'll have one widget or set of widgets near the top that will allow me to say we're X% along the way to being able to launch into our space adventure. And then beneath that, I'm going to have, this is going to be the actual list of things to do. So my first goal is just to get this tracker and a list. Let's start there, and then we'll get into the randomly adding things as time progresses. Okay, so within this, I'm going to add a column for my two things. We're going to have, for now, we'll just start off with a progress. We're 42% towards launch. Great. Okay. So now we've got our progress tracker. Check. That's been done. And then, of course, this is where if you're relatively new to Flutter, things get a little interesting, because from my initial diagram here, we wanted this, and again, I'll make this bigger. Hello, everyone who's joined. I want this progress tracker, and that's just text, or maybe a progress indicator at some point, like a linear progress indicator or a circular progress indicator, in case you like lines or like circles. And underneath that, we have a list. Okay, so there's a handy widget built in called list view. But, and we can see what happens when we do this. When we add the list view in and we have our children, and maybe, and we can use the built-in list comprehension for getting some items in here automatically. So I'm going to say I want 100 items. That sounds space travel is complex. We can start with 100. I'm sure that's probably plenty of items to get started with, right? For space travel. Yes. Okay. So we're going to have some number of items here, and we may have to fix this update SDK constraint so we can use the built-in list comprehension. And then I'm going to save this and restart, and we're going to end up with some issues in the debug console. So lots of errors abound. If you're relatively new to Flutter, this can be somewhat concerning and daunting because there's this long stack trace of things going on here. And so what we want to look for, we'll go up to the top and see that there was a vertical viewport that was given an unbounded height. So the reason for that is twofold. One is we have this this column which tries to make its vertical height the size of its children. Then we have this list view which says, I want to take up as much vertical space as you can, and if I can't take up more than, or if my list takes up more than that, I'm going to make it a scroll. So now we have these two competing ideas within our widget tree. We have a column which says, take my children, make it as big vertically as we need to, and we'll lay them out as necessary. Then we have the list view as a child of that saying, take up as much space as possible. So now the column and the list view are at odds a little bit, and Flutter, our layout engine, doesn't really know what to do with that. And there's a way to fix that. And the way to fix that is to use a special kind of widget. So I'll preface this by saying column itself is a special kind of layout widget. It is a type of widget that operates on this notion of flex. So if you are familiar with web development, where we have this this notion of a flex box, right, where we have things where we can put things towards the beginning of the box, towards the end of the box, towards the center of the box. We have directions that we can flow in. If you're familiar with web design, this is the same sort of idea, where we can have a container that we can flex things around and give things different weights and give things different proportions of the sizing and give things centering versus spacing evenly throughout. And so that's what column is, as a special kind of widget. And so as the flexed style of layout widget, we can also then use some flexed style children widgets. So we can wrap the list view in expanded. And now we might have to restart it. Now we lovely have a list here. So what this expanded has now said is we're kind of looking at both things in both directions. The column is looking at that and saying the text is only going to take up this amount of space, and there's nothing special about that. It's just a text. We don't have a positioned and aligned and expanded or anything like that. We just have the text. It's going to take up however much space it takes up. The expanded, then, we're going to say take up the rest of the amount of space available for that column to take up. And now suddenly the list view has a constraint. And it can say, okay, the expanded has given me a certain amount of height to take up, and my list is going to take that up. Anything more than that, we'll scroll it away. We have a question in the chat of why is every Flutter streaming writing for loops in a list view instead of list.generate. For me, I don't know why everyone else is doing it. I guess it's the cool thing, so we're all going to do it. But for me, what I'm using it for here is just for prototyping and just for trying to get some notion of where things are in the app. When I get to the real list, where I have actual items, and if you missed in the beginning, my goal here is eventually to have an app that randomly adds to-do items to this list. And so to randomly add things to a list, that means we have a dynamic list, which means we're going to have to use some other version of list creation. So I might not use list.generate, but I might use some kind of builder or delegate on list view to get that list managed. We might start off with an empty list, in which case we don't need list.generate or any kind of for loop list creation, and make it dynamically in the future. So hopefully that answers a little bit of why here we're using that version of list rather than list.generate. Okay. If there's a response to that in the chat, hopefully then that'll give us another indication of how long the chat delay is. Okay, so we've got our initial list and progress indicator here that more or less matches the start for what I wanted here. But we can make things a little bit more interesting here if we do a list tile, give this a title, and now my text is there. Seems like we're at about a 30-second delay on the chat. Okay, that's not too bad. So I'm going to make these list tiles instead of just text. And then all good to-do item builder things have a checkbox. And we're going to have to factor that out eventually at the future because in order to properly manage a checkbox, we'll need to have this be a stateful widget, but I'll get to that in the future. Right now, what I need here is a checkbox in that way isn't defined. Is it just lowercase b? Yes, okay. And then we need an unchanged. For now, I don't need it to do anything, but it takes a parameter, which is the value, and we need to start with a value. And we'll get rid of that. Okay, we're coming closer to having a to-do item builder. And so what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I have these checkboxes now that don't actually work yet. That's simply being able to handle the onchanged properly. And as I just mentioned half a minute ago, that's going to probably need some kind of stateful widget because we'll need to be able to manage the state of this checkbox, whether it's checked or not. Checkboxes also have a potential third state. That's called the try-state option. We can investigate that in the future, but so we might need a stateful widget for this. And so I'm going to start there, and we'll extract a widget. We'll call it the to-do item. And calling it that probably implies that the list tile should come with it. And so I'm going to go and do that. The list tile is going to come with my to-do item. And we can put this child back to there. That I is no longer relevant. And we can go back up here and add our to-do item right there. And we'll reformat again. And so I've made no actual changes to this app yet. All I've done is factored out this list tile so I can have the checkbox here. And this is within a stateless widget, but I did mention that this needs to be a stateful. Fortunately, most of our IDEs can help with this, and we can convert to a stateful. That has now probably broken my hot reload. So this is a common question that we see with newer Flutter developers on why is this now broken? And the short version of it is that when hot reload is working properly, or when it always works, it starts at the top of your app and it looks at this widget. So at the top we have this run app. What run app does is puts whatever widget you give it as the root of the widget tree. And if we went in and looked at it, we can even see here that it's calling a nicely named function of schedule attach root widget. So it's taking whatever widget we give it and putting it at the root of our tree. So that's where the start of our widget tree comes from. So we have my app. It has a material app. The material app has the home page. The home page has the scaffold, which has the column, which has etc. Right? It has our entire widget tree. And what hot reload is doing is saying, okay, let's start at the root and let's run the build methods for the widgets that are within this hierarchy. And so it goes down and it says, okay, run build for my app. Great, that just runs. Its children are the home page. We can run the build where we're returning a scaffold, a column. Within the column, we have a text. We have this expanded. Nothing has changed so far. We get to this list view. The list view has these children. And within the children, we have this to-do item. Now, when it was a stateless widget, and we might, nope, I can't convert it back. Actually, I might be able to undo. So if I undo it and bring it back, well, now we're in a weird half state. So when we were originally in that stateless version, Flutter was looking at that as I'm expecting a type of widget, and the type of widget is some kind of stateless widget. That's where that commonality in the hierarchy of classes of widgets come in. And when we change it to a stateful widget, now things have broken because we're going through that build, we're rebuilding that tree that we've devised, and we've gotten to this to-do item. To-do item is no longer a stateless widget, it is now a stateful widget. And so that's where this lovely yellow on red error screen comes from, that it was previously expecting a stateless widget, and it's not there. So we have to hot reload. Hopefully that has been a little bit of a helpful hint on how hot reload works. That'll also come into play later when we're working with this state object. Okay, so now that we've gone over that aside of how hot reload works, we've got our to-do items back, and now I want to actually be able to get these checkboxes to work. And to do that, I've got here this hard-coded value of false. So this false indicates what state this checkbox is in. Is it checked or not? So I could change that to true, and now all of my checkboxes are checked. Okay, that's what the checkbox's value does. But what I'd really like to do is have some notion of whether this is checked or not. So I'm going to introduce this into our state. Checked. It's always going to start as not checked. So we can do that, and now it's not checked. And then we have to do something with it. So the checkbox documentation tells us, if we look for the onChanged method, so that's right here, called when the value of the checkbox should change, and it passes the new value to the callback, but doesn't actually do anything. Okay, so the onChange gets, so this, what I put here was the new value. So we'll call it that. That seems reasonable. And I'm going to now set our checked to that new value. And now I might have to restart because I introduced some things outside of the build. Oh, I forgot a critical component. I need to actually change the state. There. Now, when we check our boxes, we can actually check it. So just for fun, I mentioned the try-state option. And the try-state option is introducing this third ability for an item to be, for a checkbox to be. So it can be checked, it can be unchecked, or it can be dashed, partially checked, unknown, half checked. I don't know what to call it. It's the third state. And what that's doing is taking our state, our checked option here, and it's a Boolean. It's true or false. But if we have it set to null, now we can have an unknown state. So that null state is that third state for it. Okay. We've gotten our list, we have our progress tracker, but the progress tracker is not actually tracking anything. It's hard-coded at 42%. And so now let's start to get towards updating this to be a slightly more dynamic situation. We're going to start with creating this 42% being tied to how many items are actually finished or not. And then what I'll do is make this a more dynamic list. All right. So in order to do that, let's do a few things. First, we need to know the percentage. We need to know how many items there are and how many items have been checked. Okay. So I'm going to pull out some of these numbers as constants in some way. So we'll have final item count equals 100. So now nothing will change because I haven't actually changed anything other than pulling out that number. And then we can have a maybe a finished count. And this isn't the best way to do it, but it's somewhere to start so we can at least get some notion of how well along we are. Again, this is a very intro-y app, and so I don't want to get too much into state management or inherited widgets or notifiers or anything like that just yet. We'll get there. That might be for a future stream. Futures are also for another future stream, as are streams, in case you wanted to know. What I'm going to just do a very simple version of state management here, which is I just want a callback. I want my top level list to be notified when this thing changed, and the simplest way to do that is with a callback. It's kind of like where we have these onChanged methods within here. Eventually we'll change this to a notifier instead, but we're just prototyping, so we're just going to start with the simplest version. All right, so what I want here is I want a function of onChecked is what I'm going to call this. We'll have to update the constructor to take that in. and we'll make it required just so our IDE can help us out a little bit with adding those parameters. All right, now that has been changed to to-do item, so we're going to change that to an onChecked. And this is where we'll probably need a stateful widget again. I can set that so I can get rid of the compiler error and everything checks appropriately, but I'm not using it yet. And we'll change that to this kind of anonymous function, so that I can also call the widget onChecked function. So now we've got these two tied together, but my onChecked function here isn't doing anything. One thing that we could potentially do here is modify the finished count, and it might be helpful to also pass the status here to know whether we actually need to decrement or increment or just ignore it for now, the finished count. So I'm going to change this to a function that accepts a Boolean. That's actually the return. I need to remind myself how to define a function callback and the parameters. We'll just leave it off for now because new value, because it's dynamic. We can do what we want without being too specific. So this is going to be a checked parameter, and what we can say is if it's been checked, then our finished count will increase. Otherwise, our if it's false, our finished count will decrease. And these errors are because I made this final, but this shouldn't be final because we have our finished count, and unfinished will be variable based on how much we check these things. Now, interestingly, we are getting a couple of errors here, and one of them is explicitly said here. One of them is hidden a little bit, and so the error that we're getting here is related to that tri-state notion that I talked about a moment ago, where in order to provide this notion of this partial state, so this item right here, this fourth one down, is in this intermediate state. But the checkbox widget maintains it's checked or not based on true or false. So in order to get the intermediate state, it needs to be null. That's our third state. But up here in my onChecked handler, I'm going to get rid of that so we have more space. Here in our onChecked handler, I'm trying to just see if it is checked, we increment. If it's not, we unincrement or decrement. Words are hard sometimes. And this is fine, except that this ternary operation, this Boolean statement, cannot operate on a null. So now we need to have a third state. We need to be able to handle the tri-state. An easy way to get around that is just not allow tri-states, but I think it's nice for our to-do list app to be able to see that there's maybe something in progress. So we have this notion of not done, done, or in progress. So it's nice to have that tri-state. So let's actually handle that. This is where my Dart foo may fail me for null handling. So if we're checked, then I've been writing a lot of JavaScript recently, and its null-aware operators aren't as great as in Dart, aren't as helpful at least. So that's what my fingers are familiar with right now is a lot of JavaScript for some reason. We're just gonna do that, and that should help us handle that a little bit. So our simple thing is saying here that if it's not null, then, or if it is null, don't worry about it because it's only in progress, so we're not finished. But if it is, then we're going to manage the finish. Now we're into the other error that I have here, which is that I'm modifying this finished count variable in a stateless widget. And we're kind of getting an indication here from the IDE about what's going on here, where we have this variable, which is not a final, it's not a constant, it is a variable, it's changeable. And so our IDE is giving us a notion of what's going on here, of saying this widget is said to be immutable because it's a stateless widget, it has no state, but things are changing. So we need to do something about that. Easiest thing, we're going to convert to a stateful widget, and again, we'll have to properly reload in order to get the build tree with our hot reloads to properly pick things up. So now we're making progress. We have no errors in the console. We have no squiggly underlines telling us that we're muting things when things are immutable. And so we're getting closer. Now we just need to say that this 42% needs to update to be a reflection on how much is actually completed. And I'm just going to make that an interpolated string of finished count divided by our total count. Or what did I call that? The item count. Now, as I said at the beginning of the stream, we will eventually want to make this a little bit more dynamic rather than having this hard-coded number of items, but for prototyping, this is okay. So the text is a little small here, so I'm going to make it bigger with some style. We will add some text style. Text style, font size of, I like 42, that's a good number. So now we have another error, a simple one to check for because okay, there's two errors here. One is that we need to multiply this by 100 to get a more reasonable percentage number. So we can go ahead and just start there. So now we have our 5% rather than 8%, but that's indicating another error, which is that we haven't actually updated the state when we did this. So because we had this before there we go. And the error I have here is what is my IDE saying? Expected to find a semicolon, but I have a semicolon there. And I guess, right, because I'm in the if statement. Great, live coding is sometimes difficult. Okay, now when I click on these buttons, they should automatically update. And because we have 100 items, each item is roughly a percentage points. We get some rounding errors, that's okay. We can format those a little bit later. And so this is starting to look pretty good. We can, where our percentage goes down, our percentage goes up, and we can start to imagine how this might look as a more dynamic list. Right now, as pointed out in the chat earlier, we're just using this for loop to create this list of items, but I would like at some point for this list to be able to have random items added to it. And that's kind of hard to do when it's just a hard-coded for loop. So let's play around. Let's start to see what that's going to look like. One place to start is to, let's just define a list. It's going to have some widgets in it. And this is going to be my items. Not widgets plural, just a widget. It's a list of widgets. And for the moment, for starters, when we initialize this state, this initial widget, now we can use that list generation. So I want 100 items, or more specifically, I want item count items. And we get our index, and all we're going to return now is that same list to-do item that we had here. I'll cut that out, replace that. This isn't great style because then we have this widget that's created outside of the build tree, and so we'll want to change that, do something differently with that later. But for now, we can try it just to make sure that we're getting some of the basic infrastructure working and some of the basic infrastructure pieces tied together properly. And so here then, we can just say that the children are our items. And here's that bit that I was saying earlier about hot reload. Because when that hot reload is going through, it's only running those new build methods, or all the build methods of the existing tree. And when it gets to this homepage stateful widget, it goes through, and so it's a stateful widget, so it has to build the state. We already have the state that's been created earlier. And then we get into our build, and we go through that build, and it says, okay, I take that list view, and I'm going to set this children to items. Items has never been initialized, because as part of hot reload, this init state is not run ever as part of a hot reload. It's only running these build methods. And so in order to get this new list created for us, we need to do a hot restart. So do that, and sure enough, this is still exactly where I want it to be. Okay, so we're making progress. We have our items that can be checked or not. We have our percentage tracker that is tracking how many items are checked. It's properly incrementing or decrementing as needed in order to track the number. We might have a question in chat, unless that's just a high raised hand, but in a different context, I'm doing some things with Zoom, and one of our practices there is you do the raised hand thing, icon or emoji to say that you have a question. And so, Marcello, if you have a question, happy to answer it. If you're just waving, hi. Okay. Let's test out adding items to this list. And again, for prototyping purposes only, what I'm going to do is add a floating action button to help us test out adding and removing items. Eventually, maybe we want to use the floating action button as a way for us to manually add items rather than just having items randomly added in only. But for now, we're going to have a floating action button here. And for my on pressed, what I'm going to have it do is, and I'm missing a comma, I believe. Ooh, expected to find semicolon. Okay, we'll get there. Actually, instead of a multi-line, we'll do a short line, and I'm going to have items.add, and we're going to add a new to-do item. And it has an on checked, and I don't necessarily care what it does yet. Right. Now, that. Let's add that. And that's incorrect because I have too many somethings. There we go. Too many parenthesis commas. Okay, now let's go all the way to the bottom. Let's check one of these to make sure that to have a reference point when I do an add. I click the button and I've not changed our state. So that's not going to come up immediately. But if I set state here with that, oh, right. I put the set state in the wrong place. It needs to be around the items add instead, because we can't add a set state. All right. Where did my new items come in? Did they come in the beginning of the list? No, because I still have 100 items. Oh, well, the item count hasn't changed. Let's, in order to debug this, add some actual information to our items. And let's give them a title. So now what I'm going for is being able to have some actual text as part of the to-do item, and we're going to say new item just to kind of do some printf debugging. There are other ways with some Dart dev tools and whatnot to do some debugging, but when you're trying to rapidly prototype, sometimes the printf is the easiest way. And instead of the text there, I'm going to say that this is the widget.title. And oh, because that's already a text widget. So we can remove that. Save. Most of our widgets now have no text. And sure enough, our floating action button is not actually adding anything. Right. This is a problem with the way that I have constructed this list. So this list view is a static list. We've given it a set of children at build time, and that's that. The better way to do this is going to be to use one of the other methods of list view. So let's remind ourselves of the documentation, with the documentation of what the other list options are. So the default just takes children, and that's it. It works well when all of those children are going to be displayed. It's a small number of children. If we had a list view builder, that's going to give us a constructor, which is good for large or infinite number of children. Okay, so for a space travel planning app thing, a potentially infinite number of things could arise. I hear that space is large, so that might be something that we want to investigate. So let's change this to the list view builder portion version, and this is going to require a builder option, and it no longer requires the children option. And what we'll have to return here then, let's check this. The item builder actually creates the widget instances when called. So that would tell me that it needs to return the widget. So here I'm just going to then return the items at that particular index. Okay, we've got that back now, and what we should see near the bottom is an error. Oh no. Okay, invalid range, not in range. 0.12 valid is only 113. Wonder if we got out of sync because I was clicking and adding random things. Aha, so, right, no. List view builder has no notion of how big the list is, but it can. So one of the items here is this item count parameter, and that is going to tell our builder to not call that new item builder function if the index is higher than that. So I'm going to say the item count is here, but this is going to introduce a new issue for us because I have these 100 items, and when we add more items, this item count is not changed. So now I have this set as a final. We're going to have to change that to a not final. And instead of being, so we can start it at 100. We'll probably want to make it more dynamic, but for now, so we can still do that actually. So first thing we want to do here is we will add, oops, I put that in the wrong place. That actually needs to go here. With that, we'll reformat. So once we add, we can then set our item count to be the number of items in the list. We'll save it, and because I've made changes to things about the state, just for safety, I'm going to do a hot reload, scroll all the way to the bottom, click a new item. Sure enough, and I'll click a bunch more. I have my new items. Great. So I think that's a good place to pause. We've got things in a working state. And now that we've done that, I'm going to create my Git repository to do space planner. Oops. Thank you, terminal, for trying to do something fancy with my exclamation point. So now I have my initial space planning app. I'm going to go ahead and create the GitHub repository in case you want to follow along at home. And that terminal is not picking up my credentials. That's okay. I'll do it in a separate terminal. Okay, that one's not either. I've got some credentials problems. We'll figure that out. I think it has to do with the HTTPS versus SSH. We'll figure that out offline. But I've now got the space planning app over on GitHub if you want to follow along at home. And for now, that's going to be our stream. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and watching. Hopefully, we can do some more interesting things with the app in the future. Again, this is going to be a progression of apps through the progression of building an app through from 0 to something a little bit more interesting. So hopefully this has been good for you, and it was good for me, and it was fun to try this out for the first time ever. And we will see you next time. So thanks again, everyone. And now, even though I know I'm still streaming, I'm going to try to get my GitHub repository set up so that we can end with it actually pushed. And there it is. Okay, that's going to be the official end of the stream. Thanks, everyone. Bye.